About 10 years ago, I went to the house of someone who'd passed away. It was one of the first times, maybe the very first time, that I'd ever gone to visit a family who'd recently had someone pass away in their home. I remember meeting the family and then going into one of the rooms. I think it was an upstairs room where the person had actually passed away. They'd passed away sitting in their recliner, their armchair. But what I really remember about, maybe what I remember most about the whole incident was in the room where the guy had passed away, it was like an office or an extra room. There was one wall that was completely covered with toy cars or model cars. There were all these small cars in boxes. They were all in the original packaging, and he had hung them up on the wall as though they were art. I mean, the wall was covered from top to bottom, from left to right. The entire wall, just box after box after box of these cars. Obviously, the guy was a huge collector and loved these model cars. These seemed to be prized possessions. I mean, he kept them in the mint, perfect condition, never opened. But now he'd passed away, and all that was left were all his cars that he'd collected. I don't know what happened to the cars, if they went to the family, if somebody else liked them or what, but now he was gone, and the thing he cared about so much were just these things that were hanging on the wall. I guess it resonated with me because I can be accused of being a little bit of a collector myself. If you go in my garage, you'll see box after box of comic books. I'm just like him, I guess, and it made me think, or at least in some ways I was like him, and it made me think, about myself, and I'm collecting all this stuff, but one day I'm not going to be just like him, passed away, and everything will be left behind. I know recently my wife was asking me, hey, if you die before we have kids, what do you want to happen with this stuff? And it's a good question, because it's stuff that I care about, but maybe nobody else does. So what's the point, I guess? I enjoy it, but it's not something lasting. I won't be able to keep it forever, and when I'm gone, maybe nobody else will even care. It just made me think. It just got me started thinking. And in the time since the day I visited that home in the last 9-10 years, I've gone to quite a few funerals. And I guess funerals are, they're sad, but they can be a little bit of a blessing, because as much as it is about a time to celebrate the life of this person who passed or mourn with the family, it actually gives you a little bit of time, at least for me, to kind of reflect on life, reflect on my own life, and maybe the bigger questions, the meaning and purpose of life. What's this all about? Kind of inadvertently, I've begun to kind of compare funeral to funeral. Every funeral is special in its own way, but it's hard, at least for my personality, to not think about the ways that different people celebrate the lives of their loved ones. I've gone to churches where the entire funeral was essentially a church service, a worship service, that in the very middle, one or two members of the family got up and spoke very briefly about the person who passed, but then we got right back into the worship service, and it was more about the church service. I've gone to places where it was in a church, but there was little church service about it. It was instead a long line of people who knew the person telling funny stories about their life, things that they'll miss. I've seen people get up and preach the gospel at funerals. I've gone to funerals that were not religious at all. Maybe the person who died wasn't religious. But it's interesting to see the way that they compare. I would always be interested to see what kind of stories would people tell about the people who passed. Sometimes people will just get up and say something very briefly that they really cared about the person, they'd miss them. And when I would go to the funeral of people who I didn't know super well personally, I wouldn't really get to know anything more from the funeral, because it was very brief and more about the feelings and the mourning of the people that they left behind. But I'd gone to other funerals where they talked extensively about the person, and even if it was someone I knew, I learned something new about them, because people told their favorite stories, things that the person cared about in their private life, things that had happened a long time ago that I'd never even heard about. I just always thought, I guess the egotistical part, the prideful part of myself, kind of made me wonder, what would people say at my funeral? What kind of things would people say? Who would even talk? Who would want to talk? And what would I want them to say? You know, I know that ultimately when I'm gone, they'll say whatever they want to say. But what if in the perfect world, what would I really want them to remember about me? I always grew up thinking, you know, I'd love to think when I die and go before God, God would say, you know, well done, good and faithful servant, that you've served me well, you did something good for the kingdom. I hope that God would say that. I guess we'll see when I get there. But what would the people I left behind say? You know, would the people at my funeral talk about what a Christian warrior I had been, that I had spent my life devoted to Christianity? Or would they talk about every comic book that I collected, or the things I did on my days off, or how much I loved my job, how passionate I was about working? What would they talk about? You know, to be honest, I think that there's some people who, if they spoke at my funeral, they might have something to say, maybe even something nice to say, but they might not even mention that I was a Christian. I'd like to think, oh, well, that's just my friends who are not religious themselves, so they probably wouldn't mention the Christian thing. But if I'm being honest with myself, it might just be that I haven't even made an attempt to make a big enough impact on the people around me. I'd love to think that when people remember me, that something about me being a Christian would be central to that identity, that they couldn't remember me without thinking about Christianity because we were so intertwined. It was such a big deal to me. But I don't know if that's true. It just makes me think, you know, we got a new year coming up. We got all these future hopes for ourselves, but really we don't know how long we got. And I don't know how much longer I have to make an impact. I hope I've got a long time, but I hope I'm not putting off my kingdom impact for the future, thinking I got more time than I really have. I'd like to, at least going forward, try to make some type of change. You know, I'd love to think that the life I'm living, somebody would remember that I was a Christian. I guess it's just pride. I mean, ultimately, if nobody remembers me, but something good happened for God, that's good enough. I shouldn't need to be remembered. And ultimately, the glory is supposed to be about God, not the great things they say about me when I die. But I hope that, I just feel like if I'm living a Christian life, if I'm really doing the things that God would want me to do, I'd like to think that somebody around me would even know I was a Christian. But I don't know. So I think going forward, when I'm thinking about my purpose or what I want to accomplish going forward in my life, I'd like to figure out a way to live a life and be the kind of influence on the people around me that when I was gone, whether they were Christian or not, they'd say, that was a Christian guy. And that when they thought about me and what was important to me, the first thing they'd think about was how much I loved God or was devoted to my faith, not what I was doing as a hobby or even what I was doing as a career. My career is important. I got to make money, but ultimately, I'm going to leave my career one day. And the people who get hired after I leave and retire, they won't remember me. They'll maybe never have even heard of me. That's all going to go away. But the one thing that's going to last is that kingdom impact. That's the only thing that's going to stand the test of time. That I don't need to be remembered in the future, in history, but I hope that I can influence someone's life for good, for the kingdom. And then hopefully in their faith are influencing others, and this is how we're going to serve God. I mean, the only thing really, truly meaningful that I could do in my life is make some type of impact for God. So I think as I'm going forward, that's my goal. I'd love to get to a point in my life where I'm living the kind of life that people would even remember that I was a Christian.